Now here's the real sound test. Tom, pick a number 1 through 5.
3.
Neil, could you hold up how many fingers that Tom said? Okay, so he can hear. Good. Okay, so, I'll walk through the books of the Bible. Today we're talking about Numbers. I know it's kind of an excursion. I mean, it's not really, it doesn't sound like a book of the Bible, but I mean, understanding the symbolism of numbers is really important. I'm kidding, it's the book. It is the book. I was going to go on a long tangent about, 3 has this symbolism and 4 is this, and 42, because 42 is the answer to life, the universe, and everything, right?
That's Jackie Robinson's number.
I've heard of that for Revelation. That
Yeah,
3
that-
has symbols, 4 has symbols, but not this number.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the book of Numbers is so called because of the 2 censuses. There are 2 numberings of the people of Israel. The Hebrew name for it is Bamidbar, or in the wilderness. Which is, as with all the other books of like all of the other first 5 books, just continues on like it's one sentence and then the next. And in the wilderness, this happened. The theme of this is, in terms of how easy it is to read, probably easier than Leviticus, but it still has a bit of a dry reading to it. There's a lot of history to it, and a lot of repetition to it, but it comes from a scheme of disobedience and obedience compared. But first, let's get the basic information out of the way. Author, Moses, time of writing, about 1500 BC. The place is pretty much going to be the same place as the next one, where it's plains of Moab, right before they go into the Promised Land. Right before all of them, except for Moses, go into the Promised Land, to be specific. Themes, the big one is obedience versus disobedience. We see time and time again how Israel is just stubborn and will not listen to God. They want to go back to Egypt, but then they get their punishment that they're told, none of you are entering the Promised Land. We're waiting a generation. And so they spend the next 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Along with that is the theme of the 2 generations, where it's the first Exodus generation, those above 20, they're all adults, and they get to see all the great miracles that God does. But they still don't obey Him. Instead, they whine and complain and rebel. But then the next generation comes up knowing the Lord, learning from their parents' mistakes, and there is a spot of hope. Literary features, the biggest one are the 2 countings of the 2 generations. The numbering is interesting if you like to talk about that. That's one of the discussion topics. But one thing to note is that in the second census, they actually end up with less people than the first one. From a purely physical point of view, they have less people, but they'd be less equipped to fight. But from a spiritual perspective, God is the warrior. He is the one who will give them victory. Along with that, this is one of the first times since Genesis that we actually see battle. Most of the other books, they skirt around, or the Lord directly fights for them with miracles or the 10 plagues. This one, the people of Israel actually go out and fight at God's command. So, let's get into the outline. The book is kind of divided into 3 sections. It's 3 different types of travel. You have Sinai to Kadesh Barnea, the place where they first had the opportunity to go into the promised land but refused. The second, where after they were turned back, they spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. And then at the end, they reached the plains of Moab, where they were about to go into the promised land again with the new generation. Getting more into it, some of the events we see at the beginning, they have the first census, and this is an old-fashioned census. It's not for taking taxes directly, but rather a counting of the fighting men. So the number would be lower than the total number of people that are actually in the caravan. Then in 3 to 4, because the Levites aren't part of the military, they're counted separately and assigned their duties as a substitute for all the firstborn. Give that a sec to reconnect. There we go. Okay. In Numbers 5, they get into more laws and regulations as they prepare to make this journey where they leave Sinai, where they spent almost a full year. So they got pretty used to being there, but now they have to figure out, okay, we made the tabernacle. This is so sacred that the common people aren't allowed to touch this stuff. How do we transport this? So a lot of regulations such as that, and then there's more laws about people who are excluded from the camp. In contrast to that, Numbers 6 talks about the Nazirite vow, where if someone wants to be specifically dedicated to the Lord, they could take this vow where they would not cut their hair, they would not drink strong drinks, and it would be... trying to think of a modern analogy. I mean, the closest thing would be like giving something up for Lent, where it's for a special time you want to show your devotion to God, so you're going to give something up. Number 7, there's another counting, this time of the gifts to the tabernacle from the 12 tribes. In Numbers 8, the Levites are installed in their offices. Then in 9, they celebrate the first annual Passover with some extra regulations for some people who were unclean because they had to be undertakers to take care of the dead bodies. And so they had a chance to celebrate it at a later time when they were ceremonially clean. Just a small, interesting side note.
Was Samson a Nazarite?
Yes. That is one of the instances. Normally, a Nazarite is someone who decides for his entire life. And then, in the first part of 10, they set out from Sinai.
Did you say they were there about a year?
Yes. A few months shy. but 9-ish, 10-ish months they spent at Sinai between receiving the Ten Commandments, all of the cleansings, and then actually building the tabernacle. They spent quite a lot of time at the foot of the mountain. Then, when they head into the wilderness, in the second part of 10, the march finally begins with all of the special directions for their marching. In Numbers 11, we see signs of rebellion already. We get 2 instances of people murmuring against God. The second one is when Moses got mad, struck the rock that God told him to speak to, and that is ultimately why Moses was excluded from entering the Promised Land. And one of the other murmurings was, "We want more meat." And so God gave them quail until they were sick of it. Then in 12, more rebellion. This time Moses' own brother and sister rebel against him. God backs him up, and Miriam received leprosy, and she had to be put outside of the camp for a time, because that made her ceremonially unclean. Then, in 13, they get to the cusp of the Promised Land, and the people are nervous, so they say, "Why don't you send some spies and we'll figure things out from there." And then, as the song says, 12 men went to spy on Canaan, 10 were bad and 2 were good. What did they see when they spied on Canaan? 10 were bad and 2 were good. Some saw giants big and tall. Some saw grapes in clusters fall. Some saw God was in it all, and 10 were bad and 2 were good. Yep. After your time?
This happened early in the time, from the time they left Egypt until the time the spies went into the Promised Land.
Less than 2 years.
Okay, so and this is when God said, "Okay, that's it."
Mm-hmm.
After the spies.
That's detailed in 14. The Great Rebellion at Kadesh Barnea, where the majority report came back, "Oh man, they're big, they're strong, there's a lot of them. We look like grasshoppers compared to them. No way we're going to be able to beat them." And people listened to them, even though Joshua and Caleb said, "No, they're big, they're strong, but we got the biggest and strongest guy on our side." The people went with the majority report, said, "We can't do this. God's brought us here to die. We want to go back to Egypt." If you had a nickel for every time the Israelites wanted to go back to Egypt, you'd maybe have $1. A nickel is a little short, but it's not reported every time they do, but however, they said, "Let's go back to Egypt." And God said, "No. You don't get to go back to Egypt. We made a covenant. You don't get to back out on that without consequences." And so when God, we don't like those consequences. We'll obey now. But it was too late. And they went to attack without Moses, without Caleb, without Joshua, and they got their behinds kicked. And so, defeated, but still rebellious, they followed God's directions and went out to wander in the wilderness. After that, there's a chapter of more miscellaneous commandments, and then rebellions galore. First was Korah's rebellion. His was specifically against Moses. Why should Moses be the leader? Do not other of us have the Spirit? God said, I put Moses in here, listen to him. And then he and all of his faction were swallowed by the ground. And then other people challenged Aaron's leadership as the high priest. And then Moses said, okay, all the tribe leaders, take your staffs, put them down overnight, and in the morning we'll come back and see the sign of who God wants to be the leader. And they came back, and Aaron's staff was budding and bearing olives. And then he had to get a new staff because that one was put in the Ark of the Covenant. After all those rebellions, we get back to Numbers 19, rules for purification of uncleanliness. And then in 20, we get the death of Miriam, Moses' sister. Moses gets his death foretold. He's going to finish up leading this stiff-necked people to the cusp of the Promised Land again, but he's not going to get the chance to go in himself. And then Aaron dies, and the high priesthood is passed down to his son, Phinehas. Passed down to his son Eleazar, whose son is then Phinehas. And then in 21a, one of the last major rebellions in this section, where the people grumble. It's been a while. God, why don't you do this for us? Why don't you do this? We're sick of this manna. And so they were fiery in their complaining, and so God sent fiery serpents against them, which is the cobras. And the way they would be saved is they look up to the bronze serpent that Moses cast, which then becomes a symbol for Jesus, who, as Moses lifted up the bronze serpent, so the Son of Man will be lifted up. But the second part of 21, finally some progress. They wanted to pass through a kingdom. They were going to pay for everything, but the kings said, way too many people, way too armed, no. And went out to fight, and the Israelites earned their first victory. It's not technically the Promised Land, it is across the Jordan, but it is their first conquests. And so they came to rest at the plains of Moab, where the rest of the story will take place. The first chunk of it involves this character Balaam. If you remember him from your stories, it pretty much cuts off about 3/4 of the way through. One of the kings says, this is way too many people for me to fight. They already beat one of my neighbors. I know what I'll do. I'll get some, I think we basically call them witch doctors today, but I'll get a prophet to call on a god to curse them. And Balaam, as a prophet of the true God, was one of the most, quote-unquote, powerful. He was a servant of one of the most powerful gods in a semi-idolatrous way. So they said, okay, we're going to go get him. He has a very powerful God. He's going to curse them. Then we can win. God wasn't going to let him go, but, they offered a lot of money. So Balaam went. And an angel of death stood in his way, and his donkey could see, but he couldn't speak only what the Lord told him to speak. Balaam finally reached his destination. Which, here's a fun Jeopardy fact. There are two animals that speak in the history of the Bible. And the total number of legs between them is 4. One is the serpent, one is Balaam's donkey.
Except I thought the serpent might have had legs prior to this.
Yeah.
Then God said, you will now be on your belly. Isn't that true?
There's some debate. I'm not going to. If someone says they had legs before God cursed them, or I'll give them the right hand of fellowship. If someone says they did it before and serpents don't have legs. Serpents don't have legs. And even if they did, we wouldn't know how many they had. Could be snake centipede. As if snakes weren't scary enough. Tom?
I don't know. They don't have eyelids either, do they? Do snakes have eyelids?
Not technically, they have a membrane that covers it, but it's still see-through. But back from that tangent. So, in 23 and 24, Balaam, he offers the sacrifices, does all of his rights to try to influence God, but God is not swayed. The only thing that comes out of his mouth is blessings for Israel. But he was still a small God. He could not turn his pagan ways, could not turn curses to Israel. But you know what would work? Making Israel a curse on themselves. And so, at Baal Peor, named after Balaam, Balaam gave the king advice, okay, if their God is on their side, they're going to win. So make them forsake their God and worship other gods, and then you'll be able to beat them. So the Moabite king sent out his most beautiful women, his best wine, and he invited them to join in the celebration and rituals to his God. And the Israelites joined in. And God sent a plague because of it. So close! And yet, they give in to idolatry. Which ultimately, the plague that God sent on them was only stopped when the new high priest Eleazar's son, Phinehas, puts God's judgment on idolaters into practice and skewered both the man committing adultery and idolatry, as well as the woman through with the spear. And that's why the name Phinehas is a very popular Jewish name to this day. But after that, stumbling and falling down a cliff, they get around to the final preparations. They take a second census, and between the serpents and the plague at Baal Peor, as said before, the numbers are actually slightly lower than before. But with God on their side, victory is still theirs. And then, on 27, there's an interesting almost aside as he's making final preparations with a group of women who their father had no sons, and in those days, the general way of passing down property was father to son. Yet, because of this exception, God gave special property rights that if a father does not have a son to carry down his name, then his daughters can inherit and the in-laws can that she would have carry the inheritance to give to her children, which was a rarity in the ancient world. Then a lengthy section about more sacrifices and vows. In 31, they have victory against the Midianites who pursued them in Exodus. Then, because they have these territories that they won in battle, some of the tribes said, okay, yeah, we want to be with you, but these are good lands. Can we just we'll still go and help you conquer the promised land, but we want to stay here. That's Gad and a chunk of Manasseh. And that was apportioned out to them. And then we get in 33, we get a brief look back about all of God's grace. This land is given to this family, this land to this family, this land to this family. And the book ends before we get to see the fulfillment, because there's still another book. Any questions or comments on the outline?
So I just vaguely remember the story of that, when they started worshiping idols. Did they also do that in Egypt? Is that where they picked that up?
Yes, they were surrounded by a theology of idols, even in Egypt. It was even stronger in Canaan and the Mesopotamian area, where there was a lot more fertility worship and a little less prosperity worship, where each person kind of had in Egypt, you worship the pharaoh and a few other past pharaohs who were people like Ba or whatever, but generally it's not to the level that the Canaanites did, where they didn't have a living God king. It was basically that they made idols that were representatives of gods, and then each person could have their own gods and even household gods. And especially in Mesopotamia, the sexual worship of the gods came in, because they didn't have the easy fertility of the Nile that brought silt regularly every year. So they relied a lot more on rain, and Baal was the god of rain. And so he needed to give it's maybe a slightly unsavory image, but since the rain makes the land fruitful, and a man makes his wife fruitful, no, the rain god has to be appeased by imitating what you want him to do for your land.
So when they built the golden calf, was that a calf, a symbol in Egypt?
Yes. There's some theories that maybe to be as kind as possible to Aaron, he was trying to do only a half idolatry, because when he cast it out, he said, "This is the Lord," and the calf was considered to be a mount. But ultimately, God said, "No. Nothing. You had the angels that formed the so-called mercy seat, but ultimately the people took the golden calf as a physical representation of the Lord, even if Aaron wanted to say, no, it was just a mount for him.
Redeemer? Is that where this came from?
It's in sort of, yes.
I sort of thought.
Yeah, there was older traditions behind it, but this was a specific rules to set it down and make sure that, yes, when it goes in, this is still in force. Anything else before we go at discussion questions? All right, anything a little shorter? A lot of these stories are a bit more familiar, and there's a bit less big discussion ones. But
When Moses strikes the rock, that is the sin that prohibits him from entering the promised land, correct?
yes,
And why was striking, God told him to do something else called, and Moses, thank you, Elaine. Moses didn't do that. Was that the sin then?
that was a part of the sin. Ultimately, it was a rejection of that it was God's leadership. Part of it was striking the rock rather than speaking to it. Part of it was that was just frustration of, I need to act like these people's God and take care of them, rather than remembering that the Lord is ultimately the one taking care of them.
Yeah, because he strikes it, doesn't he? Say, must I give you water?
Yes.
He takes the glory, and so God says, because you took the glory, then you will not be able to enter. Something like that.
As always, attitude tends to have a larger impact on action, because the Lord sees the heart, and our bodies are sinful, but the heart, if the heart is not purified, the body as a whole is much easier to purify than the heart, shall we say.
And earlier I read that it said Moses was the most humble man on earth.
But that kind of ties in with one of the other ones of Moses' growing anger problem. Anyone who's dealt with babysitting knows how infuriating children can be, especially when they should no longer be children. When they should be adults, it's even more frustrating. Because again, how many times between Exodus to Numbers did he have to deal with people just not getting it?
Well, isn't most of the Old Testament that same story over and over again?
Yes.
And
And Moses is the person who we have the most detailed account of him dealing with it.
And the one thing that amazes me, and that is, we're still doing that. We're still worshiping false gods. We're still rejecting God.
Yeah. To go off on a slight tangent, the worldview of evolution says things are getting better and better. Our worldview is, in the beginning, it was very good, and then people sinned, and it sucked ever since. We can swap around our problems, but ultimately, we're not progress. Ultimately, we as a species or culture aren't progressing, except where the gospel comes and is able to change hearts. Because ultimately, if you compare all the great lawgivers and the great reformers, they're pretty much all saying the same thing. As Jesus put it, love your neighbor as yourself. Do as you would be done by. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's pretty much all that anyone says, and we never do it! And then, because that's just a little too fuzzy to point out and to rifle, to use the rifle of the law rather than the shotgun of the law, God gave the entire law of Moses to be able to point out and say, you're doing this, and 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 this. No, you aren't. Anything else catching your eye? It is 7:22. A little shorter, but I think we can call it there. We'll close with prayer then. Lord, we fail and fall short of your perfect law so often. Only through you working in us can we obey your will. Be with us. Give us the strength and wisdom to obey your law, to truly love our neighbor as ourselves, as you have called us to do. We pray this in your name. Amen.
I'm in charge of cleaning church, and I did that today. But I'm supposed to change the parliaments for Sunday. You know, is it green? I think that's what she said.
Purple would probably be best.
So that's what I read. So can I leave that one up there, or do you want that one down?
Leave the banner up.
Okay. And then white up there, right? The purple one's hanging.
Yeah.